Hey, it's 3.2 step 3 here, and the literary aspect that you are working on is irony. So let's take some notes. A reminder that situational irony is the difference between what is expected to happen and what actually happens, while verbal irony is when the opposite of what is said is meant. You'll see both in the book, although I think we're going to see probably more situational than verbal. One thing to look for is all of the morals that Mitchell Sanders creates. I guess he's not the only one who creates them. I think Kiowa comes up with zapped while zipping, but Mitchell Sanders says, I think there's a moral here, and he's the one who first sort of coins that term moral. And so, a moral of the story is like a lesson, right? That is supposed to be learned from a moral. And so it's designed to sort of help instruct a human on how to behave, right? But what we're going to find in the morals of these stories is that it's not instructive, right? It doesn't have anything to do with how one should behave. Instead, it is mostly about how meaningless and senseless things are. And so the fact that these are even called morals is in itself ironic. We'll see a lot of puns involved in these morals that are ironic as well. Puns are plays on words where a word can mean more than one thing. And so you can watch for those for the punniness of these morals as well. So let's look at some of the examples from the first reading. Ted Lavender's death is the death that we see in the first section, and specifically in the chapter called The Things They Carried. And his death is ironic in a lot of ways. First of all, he's the most scared, and he takes tranquilizers to deal with the fear, right? And even though he is calm and relaxed because of taking the tranquilizers, he is the one who ends up dying. He's also least expected to die in the current situation, in the situation they find themselves in the chapter, The Things They Carried, and yet, of course, he is the one who dies. There's also some irony in the fact that the soldiers smoke the dead man's dope while discussing the irony in itself, because Mitchell Sanders comes up with that moral of stay away from drugs. Kiowa, I think, comes up with these, a pisser zapped while zipping, Mitchell Sanders' moral, stay away from drugs. These are all ironic. This one is a pun, really, because literally Ted Lavender was coming back from urinating when he is shot in the head by a sniper. But the term a pisser also means like a bummer, a bad thing. Zapped while zipping, he's zipping his fly afterwards, after urinating, and that's when he's zapped. We have some alliteration here, and the parallel words, I guess the consonants with the P's as well, makes it a little bit poetic here, but again, it's ironic in that he's doing something not very dangerous, and that is when he is killed. Mitchell Sanders' moral, stay away from drugs, is the one that he comes up with. And this one's ironic because the drug usage didn't lead to Ted Lavender's death. He probably would not have been saved by refraining from drugs and not being under the influence when he went to urinate. Okay, the first moral of Mitchell Sanders, though, actually comes before the Ted Lavender ones, and this is on page 13. And so this one is somewhat disturbing, so a trigger warning right now. It deals with dismemberment. The have gun will travel is what he says. And so for this one, I had to do a little bit of research, and so I imagine you will benefit from this research as well. It comes from originally a TV show called Paladin, and Mitchell Sanders says that on page 13, right? In the TV show, the words "have gun will travel" were written on a card that the character, a hired gunman, used as his calling card. The phrase has since come to mean in American slang that one is up for anything, right? The phrase has multiple meanings, as the moral in this section, which makes it a pun. First, it connects to the calling card of Paladin, because like Paladin, these GIs are gunmen in that they're soldiers who are given the directive to kill, and they carry weaponry. At the same time, the phrase connects to the idea that the men are up for anything. They're willing to commit immoral acts in this world where normal rules no longer apply. There's maybe another meaning that works on a more literal level in an ironic way, in that the dead soldier had his gun and was traveling, but now that he's dead can no longer travel or carry a gun. It makes the reader feel, I think, like being up for anything in the Vietnam War is a very dangerous thing to be, both for your morals and, who you are as a person, but then also for your ability to survive. So when the interpretation here, I think, has to do with this idea that when Henry Dobbins, the GI Sanders, gifts with the thumb, tells Sanders, "I don't see no moral," Sanders responds, "There it is, man." So Sanders is suggesting that the moral is itself meaningless. Like their duty in the Vietnam War and their morality itself, as they commit acts like dismemberment that were unthinkable before their time in the war. And just like the thumb is carried by Dobbins, so will the burden of the memory be carried by all of the GIs. All right, so that's an explanation of the first couple of morals. Then we also have this quotation on page 19, "When someone died, it wasn't quite dying," because in a curious way, it seems scripted. And because they had their lines mostly memorized, irony mixed with tragedy, and because they called it by other names, as if to insist and destroy the reality of death itself. So here we actually have, the word irony used. Just to let you know, insist means enclose in assist. So it's like to... enclose the thing that's bad with some kind of membrane to keep it separated. All right. How about some more examples? Men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. We have this whole irony about courage and bravery, right? And the idea that men are killing and dying not because they have courage or bravery, but because of the opposite. Because they are embarrassed of not doing, not following the rules and doing what they're supposed to do. Lieutenant Jimmy Cross feels guilty towards Lavender and his family for loving Martha too much to focus on the war. And so some ironic things here probably didn't contribute to Ted Lavender's death, first of all, that he wasn't thinking about Ted Lavender. And then second of all, he doesn't have much of a relationship with Martha, and so loving her is kind of meaningless because it's not reciprocated. It never was reciprocated, and even eventually later it is not reciprocated. We have the peace story on page 34, which is that story that gives O'Brien, the narrator, a truth goose. He says there was this guy who goes AWOL, but then rejoins his unit voluntarily. And he says, "It's because all that peace, man, it felt so good, it hurt. I want to hurt it back." And then he goes on to talk about how peace comes, it's sort of internal peace, after these near-death experiences in combat. Even though you're pinned down by a war, you never felt more at peace. This is after you survive something horrific, right? It has a particular peace and, joyfulness, appreciation for living, all of those things that come with a near-death experience. What else do we have here? Ted Lavender adopting an orphan puppy just to have Azar explode it by strapping it to a Claymore personnel mine and squeezing the firing device. Some irony there. O'Brien calling himself a coward for going to war instead of evading the draft by going to Canada. Typically, those who dodge the draft are called cowards, right? But instead of doing that, which he considered the brave thing to do, he goes and fights in the war. He does not hold true to his beliefs that the Vietnam War was not a war worth fighting. And because he's scared of how people will respond to that behavior, specifically his family in that small conservative town of Worthington, he goes to war and does the cowardly thing, in his opinion. All right, well, what are some effects of this literary aspect? First of all, the ironic morals point out the irony in the particular situation, boiling it down to a clever phrase that creates a dark humor, making the reader want to laugh and cry at the same time. And it reminds us that the GIs are trying to make sense of a senseless war, creating the feeling that morals no longer have meaning in this world. The ironic stories make the reader feel like the world has turned upside down and that the normal rules no longer apply. And the irony of O'Brien's cowardice makes the reader question the idea of bravery in war. And, you know, that's a pretty big belief, you know, that soldiers are brave for fighting in war, right? I mean, that's something that I think most of us would say, yeah, that's true. But this kind of makes us question that, and at least, you know, say what are we doing when we say that, or what are some of the expectations that we have of bravery? All right, how about a connection to theme? The power of voice to create truths. When the GIs give an ironic moral to a meaningless death, they create a momentary respite from the chaos of war. It's like they've made sense of it, even though it's senseless and it's got that dark humor aspect. The burden of war stories, the impact of war on the psyche, memory, and beliefs of the soldiers in Vietnam are lasting and change their understanding of right and wrong and good and bad. Innocence, Guilt, and Redemption, focusing on the irony, allows some reprieve from the guilt. It creates a way to make sense of the senseless. And then finally, story and imagination as creative forces. Writing about the irony allows O'Brien to cope with the trauma of the war. Okay, that was a lot of talking, so I will check out for now. Thanks for listening and taking notes.